Yes, we are.
Okay. All right, cool. So hold on one second. I'm going to share my screen. I'm not very tech savvy, so please excuse me with this. So first, I want to thank you all for attending the MCIC and hope to see you at future events this week and throughout the month. Uh, one thing I would like to do first is to give a statement that basically says I'm not necessarily here to criticize the ideology of conservatism. I understand that there are some facets of conservative ideology going from the tradition of Milton Friedman to William F. Buckley to those characters. But what I'm talking about today is more of how that conservative influence has pretty much influenced a whole generation or multiple generations into viewpoints that resonate and oftentimes interlock with white nationalist rhetoric. So for my students, this is part of a class also for the MCI series. So I have students that are attending or they'll be watching the video later on. And what I like for my students to do, and I also like if you could as well for all the viewers, is kind of get out a piece of paper or just jot down some notes and write down what were your initial thoughts. Now, if towards the end of the session, if you want to bring this up and discuss your initial thoughts or some of the other questions, we'll have time to do that. But at first, I want you to just write down some of your initial thoughts. What was it that you were thinking when you first saw this insurrection taking place on January 6th? What was some of the things that were running across your mind? What was actually happening? Was it fear? Was it anger? Or was it even joy in some aspects? Right. So, and then what were your thoughts about that attack in the weeks or months after? So this happened in January 6th. It's been over 2 months, a little bit over 2 months. And so what are your thoughts now about it? Are these thoughts very similar or different as when it first happened? And in what ways do you think the media has influenced your thoughts or the thoughts of other people that you know regarding this attack? So I'll give it a second just for you to look at the questions and kind of just jot down what you think. Now, for me, this is not necessarily surprising. It was surprising that it took so long for this to happen. I think that this has been something that's been bubbling for decades and maybe fizzled out with certain instances. But this is something that I thought that was going to happen quite often and during these last few years. So what I'd like to start to do is want to talk about a brief historical understanding of white supremacy in the United States. And one of the first things is that the United States has been engulfed in racism and white supremacist ideologies in every facet of our society since our inception or prior to our inception, right? Since so the understanding that the idea of white supremacy is not anything new, but the United States or the forming of the colonies as Europeans started arriving into this so-called New World, we can see it through various acts of violence with comes to written and verbal communications that the idea of white supremacy was wholeheartedly a part of just about every aspect of our forming and throughout our history. So we look at the Constitution, right? The Constitution until the 13th Amendment did not even use the term slaves or slavery, right? It just said persons or persons subjected or something along those lines, right? So we have things that were parts of the slavery in the Constitution. So we have the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise is one of the major components that brought our country together in a way, right? So you have the Three-Fifths Compromise that says that blacks were to be counted, or slaves were to be counted, and also some Native American groups were to be counted as 3/5 of the person. And in order to do that, that had to do with representation with population regarding the number of legislatures that each state could have. But even in the Constitution, we also have fugitive slave clause. Now, remember, they didn't have slaves, but they do have it in a certain wording that 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 it was about slavery, it was about runaway slaves, it's about capturing property, but they didn't use the term slave because they were essentially trying to avoid it. All right, so it was I know a lot of people would say it was very cowardly of those framers of the Constitution to actually ensure that slavery was not included. But even in our society, we had a racial hierarchy, but we also had a class hierarchy. And what poor whites were told to do was to focus on this racial hierarchy. So don't forget that you were poor. I mean, or don't think about that you're being poor, but focus more on that you're not Black, that you are white. So that racial hierarchy was going on. And also you use poor whites to enforce the racial hierarchy. So you had plantation patrols, which in the South evolved into a police force. You had overseers, which were very similar to the plantation patrols, but they were on, pretty much very similar things. But plantation patrols also went off, or slave patrols went to various states to capture slaves. And then you had the social benefit of whiteness, right? So the idea of a cohesion in a society that amplified and made sure that white supremacy was a systematic part of our culture and our identity. But then you also had the Civil War, right? So regarding the Civil War, people always ask, like, why did poor Southerners fight to maintain the racial hierarchy? Well, they did it because, or why did they fight in the Civil War? They didn't have no investment. Well, they did have an investment. They have an investment in whiteness. So you look at the constitutions or the declarations of succession of those states, Mississippi, Texas, South Carolina, they all said slavery was the main reason. And they wanted to preserve a white supremacist society in the South. So economically, it benefited rich whites. Socially and culturally, it benefited poor whites. All right, so slavery and white supremacy was the key financial and social glue in maintaining the United States for centuries, right? So I want to say, I can't emphasize enough how much race was included in every aspect of American society. This is by Joe Fegan, who's a sociologist, and he says, by the 18th century, a violently racist framing of society had been created, and it came to dominate most white views on race for the next 2 centuries. Images of lovely whiteness were soon wedded to a strong biological racism, a deterministic view that saw white Americans as the biologically and intellectually superior race, and Black Americans as the biologically inferior race. So this is from his book, Racist America. So it was in scholarly books. This was in scientific books. They did numerous scientific books. They had whole sciences of brain measurements, of analysis. Religious leaders would talk about the curse of Ham, or talk about the children, the descendants of Ham, which were Black people who were supposed to be, according to that interpretation of the Bible, was to be determined as cursed and to force into servitude. The media, politicians, every aspect was focusing on this racial identity of saying that this group is inferior to us. And then I want to go this week. This is stuff that we could talk about for the entire month and we still wouldn't delve into it. So I'm trying to brush through some things real quick before we get into the main premise of the discussion. But I think it's very important. Right. So you have in the late 1800s and 1960s, you have the rise of racial violence towards Blacks, immigrants, Jews. And anyone defined as non-whites, Asian Americans. You had Irish Americans who were not defined as white or not considered white for a good chunk of the United States. Italian Americans were not considered white in our society. So you have a system of violence that allowed folks to perpetuate. Oftentimes, the government even allowed this to happen, and many government officials were involved in some of these violent issues. So you have Jim Crow, uh, legalized segregation in the South and some parts of the North. And then you have the rise of Nazi movements. Yes, we had a Nazi party and still do in the United States. Even at the time of Hitler, we had around 20 to 30,000 people that went to Madison Square Garden in New York to attend a Nazi rally. So we had Nazism in the United States. We had race riots that were taking place all throughout the United States. And then we have the birth of the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacist movements. And now, after the Civil War, this flag, this symbol right here, becomes a very popular symbol, and it becomes a symbol of white supremacy in the United States. So we can have a whole discussion about the meaning and significance of the Confederate flag, but understand that this flag grows after the Civil War in the 20th century, talking about the 1900s, particularly 1940s, 50s, and 60s. It grows into a symbol of white supremacy and intimidation towards Blacks. Now, how do we define white nationalism? And this is from the Southern Poverty Law Center, who has a expertise in discussing these type of issues regarding hate groups. White nationalist groups espouse white supremacist or white separatist ideologies, often focusing on the alleged inferiority of whites. Groups listed in a variety of other categories: Ku Klux Klan, the neo-Confederate, neo-Nazi, racist skinheads, and Christian identity could also be fairly described as white nationalists. So these groups are oftentimes what we put in the fringe of society. These are those crazy guys that march, and they may only have like a few hundred followers or a few thousand followers, and so we don't necessarily pay attention to them. But that's one of our biggest problems, is that we don't pay attention to them until violence actually happens and occurs. And what we see right now in the United States over the past 10 years, actually, since since 2006, actually, is a steady increase in white nationalist violence, the perpetuating. And we don't necessarily use the term terrorism, which is very problematic, of looking at these people as what they are, in which they are terrorists. The Ku Klux Klan is one of the most popular hate groups, or well-known hate groups, and there's still argument in Congress of declaring them a terrorist organization, which is what they are. So we have a rise in movements. In the 1960s, we have a new rise of white nationalist movements. So in the early 1900s, you had the rise of the KKK, the second rise of the KKK. So the KKK fizzled out in the late 1800s, and then they rise back with the increase of the popularity of the movie Birth of a Nation, which basically makes the KKK look like heroes. So this film becomes a form of propaganda across the globe, across the nation, that grows into making the Klan look like as heroes, as a great organization. So, but by the 1960s, they start to die out. They're still around, but they're not necessarily as prevalent, but they're the most well-known. But you have other white nationalist groups, and they're in the fringes. Once again, they looked at it as fringe groups, and they fought against integration. So they would go, and sometimes they would get in fights with people, civil rights activists, or they would oftentimes go to colleges and give lecture circuits. One name is George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the leader of the white supremacist Nazi movement in the United States. He's the first person to coin the phrase white power. And he used to go to college campuses and give lectures, kind of like Milo Yiannopoulos or other folks that are have connections to white nationalist movements that oftentimes come to college campuses and cause a lot of animosity, cause a lot of trouble on campuses, and oftentimes police have to interject and be involved in them. So in the 1970s and 80s, what we have here is that people who come back from the Vietnam War realize of the failures of the United States regarding the Vietnam War. Why were they there? What were they so supposed to be doing? And at that same time, you have the expanding and the growth of civil rights movements in the aftermath of the civil rights movements that give minorities, particularly Blacks, more access to rights, access to economic advantages also. So you have this criticized intrusion of the federal government. They're talking about the government as being a failed experiment, right? So they don't look at it as the government as being a friend of theirs anymore. They look at the United States government as an enemy, and they are talking about essentially overthrowing the government. Race is involved in this heavily, but also just the idea of the federal government just expanding. So they're talking more about states' rights, more even communal rights, but not necessarily the federal government. So they see the federal government as an enemy, right? And then in the 1980s, we see the computer message boards. Now, I don't know the history of the internet or anything, so this was kind of really shocking to me. I knew in the 1990s this was happening, but they said it's early in the 1980s, you see computer message boards, and white nationalist movements were the first to use the internet as a way of spreading their message across, right? And also if they focus on a violent youth. And we'll talk a little bit more about this because I want to show that the leadership of these white nationalist movements actually come from upper or middle class backgrounds, but they recruit troubled teenagers or troubled youth to go and perpetuate this violence. So it's a form of exploitation for that's taking place. White nationalist movements have constantly grown since the 1990s, and with the President Obama's presidency, it increased dramatically. There becomes a multitude of various groups that grow into white nationalist movements. They start becoming somewhat organized, and they change their rhetoric. They're not necessarily shaving their heads off or wearing hoods. They're wearing suits. They're trying to be more, I guess, more palpable to our society or to everyday white Americans to try to use it as a recruiting tool as well. Now, what's happening with these movements? These are some common traits. You have people that are wealthy that are in the leadership position, right? So the Ku Klux Klan, those were wealthy Confederates at the beginning of the KKK. With George Lincoln Rockwell, he was a middle-class guy. With a lot of these others, they come from college educated, they come from middle class or higher. And what do? They recruit isolated, poor, often abused youth, and they are encouraged to commit violent acts. They don't necessarily say, hey, go bash this person, or anything like that. They kind of do it in a more rhetorical form, but essentially they are telling those youth to go and commit violent acts. They believe whites are under attack, and they are talking about having a race war. This is something that's been going on since the early 1900s too, this idea of a race war, and it's still happening today. You go on those message boards and you see that that's what they're talking about. And they think that they are the oppressed group. So what's happening here is this idea of affirmative action or immigration, allowing all these immigrants to come is causing our society to die. And whites will be replaced by a Jewish-led conspiracy, right? So this whole thing is common amongst all these hate groups. This is not something that's one group is isolatedly saying. This is something that they all believe, right? So even though they have squabbles within themselves, they have a commonality. They're against gun laws. They're saying gun laws are wrong and everything. And they're talking about the foreign policy that happens after the Vietnam War, in which the United States goes other places. Now, I don't know where they're getting that from, because the United States has pretty much been in a militaristic power for much longer than the Vietnam War. I think it's more that we feel like many Americans feel like we lost the Vietnam War, or we didn't win the Vietnam War. So maybe that had something to do with it too. And some of those earlier folks in those white nationalist movements in the 1970s, 80s were Vietnam vets. Now, we can see, and there's been much discussion about what's taking place today, but we can see that there's a correlation with this, in which the military, the police force, the members in the government are being infiltrated or influenced or supporters of white nationalist movements, right? So this image right here is a image that a white nationalist who was served in the military, he put on his Twitter, right? So that is a swastika, which is basically he's aligning himself with a Nazi. And there's been others that have done similar things. Right here is a image of Charlottesville, of what happened, in which white nationalist groups were carrying shields. Some people looked at that and they said that the police didn't do anything regarding this. Some of those had weapons. There was one particular small video in which a white nationalist shoots at a crowd of anti-fascists, and the police officer does nothing, just standing there. Here you see the police force with the Confederate flag. Now, what message is that conveying to anyone who is not considered white? That's conveying that there's no justice for you in any way, shape, or form. Now, this one is the more complicated one. It's the Blue Lives Matter flag. And how people interpret this flag, because it's a relatively new flag, I'll leave it up to you. But what I am trying to say here is that this flag is used as a form of intimidation, or as a tool of white supremacy by white supremacists. It's the new Confederate flag in some circles. So I'm not saying that's how it was created or anything like that. What I'm saying is how it's used amongst white supremacists, and they're using that as a new form of the Confederate flag. So what's next? We have the KKK, and how the KKK was essentially had many people and that had a lot of power. You had police force that were members of the Klan. You had judges that were members of the Klan. You had senators. You had governors. And there's arguments about two presidents. I think it's Harding and Truman that may have been members of the Klan, but that's the speculation, not necessarily 100% true. Plus, Truman desegregated the military, so I don't know how actual that is. Oh, he was racist, though, don't get me wrong, but was he a white nationalist? I don't know. The FBI warned that white nationalists were infiltrating the police forces as early as 2006. And there's been an increase of military service members with ties to white nationalist groups, right? So two of the reasons, and there's probably multiple more, is that they can learn military tactics for future warfare, right? And they could use their badge to abuse people of color, and they can recruit more people, right? So these are some of the things that could happen with the infiltration. And this is something that the United States government has failed to do in addressing. This is something that our police forces have failed to do in addressing. And so we have a lot of folks, and there have been service members, and there have been police officers from across the country that were there at the insurrection, Perpetual, and part of the insurrection. Now, here's what happens when you have someone with military experience and military knowledge being involved into white nationalist movements. Now, there's some arguments of whether Timothy McVeigh was a white nationalist, but he hung out and he was in circles with white nationalists. He communicated, he went to the gun shows, he went to some of those rallies. So whether he was or not, he still is, because if you hang out with a white nationalist, guess what you are? So that's my viewpoint. And so we see what happened at the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. That's just one example. But how did white nationalists get the idea that they are the oppressed group? This is something that a lot of white nationalists keep saying. They're talking about that they're discriminated regarding affirmative action policies. Well, affirmative action policies, we can have a discussion on that, but that's not what affirmative action does in any way, shape, or form. And it does not discriminate in any way. And we can have a discussion about this later on. But they think that they are other groups, particularly groups that have been historically oppressed, are the ones that are oppressing whites, or that the government is actually giving unfair advantages to these groups. So we could see that there's been polls, there's been surveys, there's been discussions about this, and places that propagate this is, and I'll show you about this in a second, is our conservative media. But first, I want to talk about something that happens. It's called dog whistle politics. Dog whistle politics is basically using racially tinged phrases without using racist phrasings, right? So I'll talk about the Lee Atwater quote in a second, but it's kind of talking about saying like inner city, or even bringing Chicago, right? So in our minds, when we talk about Chicago or crime in Chicago, what are we talking about? We're talking about particularly crime, either cause or victims of crimes that are Black, right? That's the idea, right? So we talk about urban. What does urban mean? Urban means cities, and who lives in the cities? It's the idea that Black folks live in the cities, right? So that's kind of like certain things that is one example of dog whistle politics. There's tons of others, right? So there's actually a book called Dog Whistle Politics. This is where I got the image from. It's from the cover that that delves deep into discussing the issues of how this dog whistle works. But something that stands out the most is by Lee Atwater, who was a campaign manager of Ronald Reagan. He worked in the Nixon campaign, and he was also worked with Roger Ailes, who was the person that was the architect of Fox News. And I'm going to say the N word, but I ask that you please do not say it, because it's very problematic, and I'm going to say it because I think it's important to hear this discussion. So Lee Atwater talks about this in an interview that took place in the 1980s. He says, you start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you. So you have to say stuff like forced busing and states' rights and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes. And all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is that Blacks get hurt worse than whites. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner. So what he is saying is you have to change your language. In the 1950s, we knew that those folks that were saying these terrible racist terms and using violence and stuff, those were racist. But we can't say forced busing, or we need to have like states' rights or religious freedom, right? We can't say that's discriminatory, but it is. That type of rhetoric is, but you have to be critical thinking about what is actually taking place with those terms now. So I want to give you some examples of what's happening when it comes to some of these dog whistles. And I want you to understand that white nationalists are starting to refine the way they say things that fit into something similar to what's being taking place right now. So Ronald Reagan was talking about a woman in Chicago, and this is a true story about this woman. She had mad game because she hustled the system very well, right? But what's happening? He's saying this in front of a bunch of elderly white women that are literally clutching their pearls. When you hear the video, they're like totally aghast of what's taking place. So he says she used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veteran husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year. And what happens here is people are like, oh my gosh, she's Black. He doesn't say it, but we know she is. She's in Chicago. Once again, the dog whistle. And now we're afraid, oh my gosh, what are we going to do about this? Ronald Reagan says we need to stop these so-called entitlements or social safety nets. And people agree with this, right? So it's like, this is the fear that's taking place, that somehow this undeserving group that is non-white is receiving these benefits and taking advantage of the system. So therefore, since the 1980s, we've had a super crumbling of the social safety net in the United States because of this rhetoric. And people have been supportive, even people who may even benefit from these. So you have poor whites that receive Social Security and food stamps and welfare, but they also believe in long of this, that those people are undeserving. I may need it, but those folks over there are undeserving. And the folks that are undeserving are oftentimes people of color. Rick Santorum even said this. Now, he said this in Iowa, and he said this at a diner in Iowa, in which there were no people of color at all. It was all white. And he says, I don't want to make Black people's lives better by giving them somebody else's money. I want to give them the opportunity to go out and earn the money. So what's he saying? He's saying Black folks shouldn't be receiving this money from the government because you're not receiving this money from the government, but I want them to get off their lazy butts and I want them to go out and earn their money. Now, we look at this and he's talking about welfare, but who's the primary beneficiaries of welfare? It's overwhelmingly white. Excuse me. Right? So whites make up the majority of welfare, but what he's doing is using race to gather some points from those races that believe that don't understand that whites receive welfare at a higher rate than any group. Newt Gingrich said, and these are all people that ran for president. Rick Santorum ran for president. Ronald Reagan was a 2-term president. Newt Gingrich ran for president in 2012. And he says African-American communities should demand paychecks and should not be satisfied with food stamps. So once again, he's saying that, like, hey, Black folks need to get off their lazy behinds, right? So it goes along with our rhetoric in the United States, this collective understanding that Black folks are lazy. And so therefore, he's saying that he's doing the righteous thing of saying Black folks should not do this. Now, who's he saying this in front of? He's saying this in front of an all-white community because he ain't saying this in front of no Black folks. And he's calling Obama the president of the United States, the food stamp president, right? What kind of connection is he showing about this? Obama's Black, food stamps, therefore we need to stop this, right? So there's something that's taking place in here that in the eyes of racists, that they're looking at this and saying, yes, 100%, I agree. We got to stop those people from getting something that I don't receive. So therefore, if they're getting this and I'm not, therefore I'm the oppressed group. White folks are the oppressed group. That's what they're saying. Paul Ryan, who was the Speaker of the House. Newt Gingrich was also the Speaker of the House at one time too, in 2014. Now, Paul Ryan is from Wisconsin. We have got to this tailspin of culture in our inner cities. Once again, inner cities. What's he talking about? He's saying black, but he's not saying black. In particular, of men not working, in just generations of men not even thinking about working or learning the value and the culture of hard work. Basically, he's saying black folks are lazy and they need to work hard. They need to learn the value of hard work. How insulting is that? How assaulting is that? But he knows who he's talking to. He's not talking to black folks. He's actually talking to his primarily white audience. And who he said this to was a conservative radio program. And that conservative radio program host was the former Secretary of Education. And he said himself, that Secretary of Education, if you want to stop inner city crime, then we need to have more black abortions. Now we have this also, the rhetoric that comes in once more. So this is Steve King, who is no longer in Congress, but at one time he was, and he associated with white nationalists, openly associated with white nationalists. And he uses the rhetoric of a politician in saying this. He says, for everyone who's a valedictorian, he's talking about immigration. He's saying, for everyone who's a valedictorian, there's another 100 out there that weigh 130 pounds and they've got the calves the size of cantaloupes because they're hauling 75 pounds of marijuana across the desert. What is he saying here? Saying that all these folks are drug dealers. He's saying maybe there may be one good one, but out of the 100, there's 99 of them that are drug dealers or drug mules, and they're evil people, right? So you see what's taking place here. He's not saying that, but he's saying that. But then you have Donald Trump, who knowingly or not broke the dog whistle and pulled out the bullhorn. So now he openly says, and this is when he first announces that he's running for president. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. He and Steve King are saying the exact same thing. It's just that Steve King is much more polished in his rhetoric and how he's saying this. So where does conservative media come from? And I'm going to talk about just a small, because there's a whole lot of figures that we could talk about, but I want to talk about a little bit, and I want to talk about the heavy hitters. And nobody hits as heavy as what Rush Limbaugh did, right? Rush Limbaugh averaged 15 million listeners weekly in his years as being a conservative host. And he was the one, like, he was a kingmaker when it comes to conservatism. If you had Rush's seal of approval, you were going to win elections. You were put in a position to win elections. He was probably the most influential conservative in the last, I want to say, 30 to 40 years. He is considered the hero in conservative circles. But what else did he do? He spewed tons of racist, sexist, homophobic, and classist rhetoric on a daily basis. One of the most despicable things that Rush Limbaugh did was he would read off people who died of AIDS in the 1980s from complications of AIDS, and in more of a celebratory, not to like honor the dead, but more of a celebratory fashion. And he did that as a part of his regular routine. He said so many things. I mean, I don't have enough time to really talk about Rush Limbaugh, but he did spew a ton of homophobic, sexist, and racist rhetoric constantly. And he constantly misinformed his audience. But he was also one of the most powerful people in the conservative movement. And he was super rich. He was friends of Roger Ailes. He was a big fan of Fox News. We'll talk about that. And before he died, his net worth was $600 million. And so it shows you how lucrative that type of rhetoric is. Now, Fox News, it's been for nearly 20 years the number one news source in cable. It's a home or it's been a home for conservative viewpoints, and they have pushed very similar narratives. So Fox News is very unique because they have certain parts of throughout the day of their news broadcasts that don't necessarily have uh, political viewpoints. They're more of our standard traditional viewpoint of what news is. But then you go into their prime time slot that kill on the ratings all the time. And you have Megyn Kelly. Now, Megyn Kelly would say things before she left Fox News. She had a very, very popular segment that she did on a regular basis when she talked about the new Black Panthers. And she would say about the new Black Panthers, it was a small video of two Black Panthers that were at an election station in Pennsylvania, but then she would show that. And the audience would constantly get bombarded with that idea of the Black Panthers are stopping people from voting. They never did. They were just there, maybe as a form of intimidation or something, but they never stopped anybody from voting. And the new Black Panthers are troubling and problematic as anyway. But this particular segment won her a lot of points because she was constantly talking about this all the time. She also said some other things, and then when she went to NBC, she got fired for saying some things that were problematic. Also, Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity nightly on their show, they would talk about issues of race. They would talk about immigration, the invasion. A lot of other Fox News would talk about this invasion that's happening at the border. They would use that term invasion. So when we think about invasion, we think we're under attack. And so people that are not informed would take this information and think that they are actually being attacked. And Laura Ingraham was part of that too, right? So if you look at I think it's called the Chiron, or the title at the bottom, it says some parts of the country, it seems like America we know and love doesn't exist anymore. And what she's talking about is that the demographics are changing in the United States. And now the heartland or the real America is being attacked. And so what does that say for folks that live in that so-called real America? So Platteville, I guess, is somehow put in that real America. If we're from Platteville, what's that say to us? Oh, we're under attack. Something's happened. So once again, I'm saying they all have very similar tropes. They are very critical of Black Lives Matter. They talk about this idea of the war on cops. They talk about this change of our religious ideas in the United States, saying that there's a war on Christmas, even though it's not, but they keep bringing this up. They talk about immigration as being an invasion. Just recently, and even in 2012, with bathroom bills being passed in the United States, or 2014, they're spitting transphobic ideas. They're talking about socialism, but never giving a definition of socialism. But somehow the audience knows that socialism is evil and bad, right? And they always talk about American values and the real America. So this peddling of the fear is very lucrative. And Fox News has a set audience that is loyal than any other news source until recently. But they've had a loyal following nonstop, and they've been making billions of dollars off of this for the past 20 years. But the most troubling one is Tucker Carlson, who is new. I think he's been around in Fox News for a few years, but he has a #1 news show on cable. And he calls white supremacy a hoax. He said that multiple times. He even says that he can't find QAnon because there's no specific website for them. But he understands that, right? So he's saying white supremacy is a hoax because some of his audience members are white supremacists, so he can't call them out. He says QAnon, I don't think it exists. He can't disavow QAnon because he's got a certain audience that may be affiliated with QAnon, right? So what's taking place here? He's talking about multiculturalism is a threat to our society, to European or Western culture. So these are things that he is saying as being an attack on Western culture, European culture. When people use those terms, Western and European culture, in that form or fashion, they are getting it word for word from white nationalist websites, right? So you're getting that information so it's a very a transition or a gateway drug, if you will, from some of these folks to white nationalist movements. So white supremacists love them. David Duke, who was a former Grand Dragon of the KKK, Richard Spencer, who is a leader in white supremacist movements and one of the architects of the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. He's mentioned multiple times on 4chan and 8chan, which are white supremacists or chat groups, chat rooms in which white supremacists heavily dominate those areas. The Daily Stormer, which is a white supremacist website, calls Tucker Carlson their greatest ally. So you see what's happening right here. I don't know if Tucker Carlson is a white nationalist or not. I think he's more as a person who sees a economic opportunity to make money and become the #1 rated host on Fox on cable news by peddling this type of stuff, right? So this is a mainstreaming of language that is oftentimes used by white nationalists, right? So he's also says foreigners come to our country and kill us, right? So he's talking about this idea. It's something that white nationalists have been using for a long time. Now, what's happening now is because of younger generations are getting indoctrinated this. They're not watching Fox News. They're not watching cable news. What they're doing is going on the internet. And when it comes to this, you have Facebook and Twitter where oftentimes you have a lot of troubling stuff that comes out of those things, right? So we know, I'm sure we probably have friends and family that have put some relatively nonsense on Facebook and Twitter, and we just get it. But sometimes people get it, and then we buy into it, and we believe it, and we think it's real. But what's happening with YouTube, which is very different, is YouTube has an algorithm that tries to get people to watch more videos, because the more videos you watch, the more money YouTube makes. So these are all corporations: Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. They're corporations, and their goal is to make money. It's not about trying to be right or wrong, not trying to be just or anything like that, or seek out and find out all the bad people that are on here and get rid of them. That's not what YouTube and Facebook and Twitter does. What they do is that they make money, and the YouTube algorithm increases their revenue for the more that people watch. And sometimes people go and watch stuff from very troubling folks, people that would criticize the idea of white privilege, even though they're not saying about white privilege. They're usually not necessarily accurate in their discussions about white privilege, but they're using that idea, saying white privilege is false. They're talking about feminism is the reason why some men may not be able to have a female partner. So they're talking about what's called incels, involuntary celibate, who are very, very troubling and oftentimes very violent. And also regarding their discussions online, they're very violent towards women, towards LGBTQ plus groups. They say a lot of despicable things, right? And they say a lot of despicable racist things. They talk about this idea of PC and cancel culture oftentimes, which March 22nd, I'll be doing a discussion on cancel culture, so we can look at that and see whether that actually exists. And some talk to white nationalists, literally. So one is Dave Rubin, who is more as a mainstream person of what's called the intellectual dark web. He had a discussion with white supremacists before. One particular one is a man named Stefan Molyneux, who basically made an argument saying that whites are more intelligent because they have bigger brains. Now, when you bring that kind of stuff that's from 19th century, from the 1840s and 50s, and you try to bring that into 2020s, then you got a serious problem taking place right here. But that's what happens. And people are like, oh, well, maybe he's true. He's right. Without any type of evidence, without any type of scientific data, people are making millions of dollars off of here, right? So these conservatives oftentimes are even funded by, or these personalities are often funded by billionaires themselves. Dave Rubin is oftentimes funded by specific billionaires. Same with Ben Shapiro, who receives funding from billionaires. Now, Ben Shapiro is different because he's Jewish. So the anti-Semitism that takes place amongst these arguments, he is vehemently against, and he tries to call that out. But what else does he do? He supports everything else that's taking place: the anti-feminism, the anti-LGBTQ plus, the anti amongst racial, anti against racial groups and having access to rights or privileges. So this is something that takes place also in here. And then what happens is people go into this rabbit hole. Now, I've gone into a rabbit hole multiple times with watching YouTube videos, but some of these folks get into this and then they commit acts of violence. So you have Western civilization being under attack. Immigration equals evil. Queerness is a disease and mental ailment, something that people don't say anymore, but now it's becoming common. It's becoming much more mainstream once again. The control of women. Jordan Peterson, who is one that's revered in this intellectual dark web, talks about we need to have enforced monogamy, meaning that one man for one, or one woman for one man, and not necessarily giving women the sexual liberation of having multiple partners if they wanted to. And this has led to violence. Now, this person right here is considered a hero in white nationalist circles. They call it, they even copy his haircut, which is a bowl cut, and they call him the roof cut. And he was labeled a lone wolf. He's the one that went into the African Methodist Church in South Carolina, and he killed 9 people. And the first thing he said, and he got this information off the internet, was that you're taking everything away from me. You're taking women away from me, right? So once again, it's talking about control of women. And it says you're denying me the right. So somehow he saw that Black folks were taking something that was his, he was entitled to, whether it was economic, whether it was sexual, whether it was cultural, it was somehow being taken away from him. And then you have the Pittsburgh shooting that took place at the Tree of Life Synagogue in October of 2018, where you have 11 killed and 6 wounded, right? So the murderer went down a rabbit hole of right-wing media, and he believed in that the idea, what's called the Great Replacement, that Jews are somehow going to replace whites. And I want to go back to that Jews will not replace a statement that they were talking about, that they were saying in Charlottesville. This is in 2019, August 3rd, El Paso, Texas, in which a shooter goes in, a murderer goes in and kills 23 people, injured 23 more, mostly Latinx. So he wrote a white supremacist manifesto and posted it on 8chan. He was inspired by the mass shooting at the mosque in New Zealand. The same shooter at that mosque in New Zealand said that he was influenced by the internet once again, right? So this thing that takes place is getting this information, or this false information on the internet, and then acting upon it. And the white nationalists are looked at him as a hero once again, and they mock the victims. So right here you have the Unite the Right rally that took place in Charlottesville, Virginia, in August 2017. And you see these folks going and using this. So what I'm saying here regarding this individual with the MAGA hat is that white nationalists have used that as another form or another symbol they have embraced as well. So just understand that. And I know we're at 7 o'clock, but I still have a little bit more to talk about because I think this is very important. So please, if you can, stick with me, and we'll be able to finish this, and then we'll be able to have a discussion with this. And you see the Confederate flag constantly there, the Nazi flag constantly there. And then you see these guys here with their Centronella candles, and they are chanting, Jews will not replace us. And what they're talking about is what's called the Great Replacement, in which they think the Jews are going to replace them and get rid of whites in America or whites in the world, and then replace them with Blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, and anyone else that's defined as non-white. So that's their fear. And they're getting this from years and years and years of hearing this information, whether it's from Tucker Carlson, who even brought up about white genocide in South Africa, even though that's totally false. So much so that President Trump even tweeted about it one time, to more dark web type of discussions. And then we have what happened in March or January 6th, in which people stormed the Capitol building. So these are just some of the images that took place. This is that so-called QAnon shaman that's getting much more preferential treatment in prison than many other folks that are in prison. You have people there just storming the Capitol building, fighting with the police, killing a police officer, gouging police officers' eyes. It was a total destructive terrorist attack. And that's the thing. Those mass shooters that I brought up earlier, they're not labeled as terrorists. These folks right here have not been labeled as terrorists. But in my eyes, and I think I want you to understand, is that's what they are. They're terrorists. But they're not. Why aren't they labeled terrorists? What is it about them? What is it about their appearance that does not identify them, that people don't identify them as terrorists from a larger scale? So people are talking about this as being an inside job. Now, there's still a lot of investigation that's taking place, that's going on, but we can see there are some things that are very skeptical, right? So this is not trying to be a conspiracy theorist in any way. I'm saying that there's some evidence behind this. So the police undermanned, and the DOJ just made a statement, and it took hours to send federal troops, and the police were undermanned, and they did not send any troops at all until it was much too late. Some of those police officers took selfies with the insurrectionists. Some of them, we look at video and don't necessarily know the whole details behind it, because that's why the investigation takes place. But it looked like some of them just opened the gates for them, of the barriers, right? So there were police that attended the rally, not as police officers, but as insurrectionists. Some leaders of hate groups were given tours days before. There's speculation, and there could be some evidence about this. One particular congressperson, Lauren Boebert, who is from Colorado, she tweeted about Pelosi's, Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi's location. So there is some type of connection that takes place here that may be something that is not necessarily a conspiracy theorist, but more of could be legitimate. Paul Gosar, who spoke at White Nationalist Conference, he tweeted in encouragement of the protest, not necessarily the insurrection itself, but the protest that took place prior to the violence really started. And then we have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is from Georgia. She's a QAnon supporter, and she was supportive of some of the things that took place also. And there were numerous politicians that would talk about stop the steal. The reason why this insurrection took place was to believe that the election that took place in November is illegitimate. And there were some members of the Trump campaign that supported or even talked to, there's one, I think that was talked to one of the Proud Boys. And we don't know what they talked about. The FBI is still further investigating, and hopefully they will have the guts to really look at this information full force. So what else are we seeing? We're seeing reasons. What are some reasons why this is happening? Well, perpetual fear of a white takeover. So once again, it's of a non-white takeover. They will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. And the fear of their demographics changing, right? So the demographic changes in which whites will eventually be the minority in the United States. And saying that the elections are illegitimate, that it didn't happen. And why did it not happen? It's because we had a huge proportion of Black and brown and indigenous folks voting and actually being very crucial to winning the elections. Indigenous and Latinx populations in Arizona and Nevada won the election for Joe Biden. Black folks won the election in Wisconsin, of all places, because of Milwaukee, and also in other places like Georgia, right? So somehow those folks voting are illegitimate votes. That's why right now you see an influx of state legislation taking place that is trying to make voting harder for folks. Masculinity is under attack. But at the same time, this idea is we're being too feminized in our society. I know that Fox News even talked about the wussification of America, but at the same time promoting hypermasculinity. And I'm a gun owner, but we have a lot of guns in the United States, more guns than people, just about. But who has guns? It's 20% of the population that has all the guns. That's crazy. It's not like one gun per person, but it's 20% of the population that has all the guns. Violence against women. You should see some of these chat rooms that perpetuate violence towards women, rape culture, talking about LGBTQ plus violence. We see a rise of trans violence that's taking place in our country right now. So all this kind of stuff is this fear of this group having access to rights that were once exclusive to a white male population. Economic despair. In the 1980s and 1990s, we had deindustrialization, we had the outsourcing of jobs. And most of those jobs were very good quality jobs, oftentimes union jobs. And what have we replaced them with? We've replaced them with opioid epidemics, with alcoholism, and we've also replaced them with low-wage jobs. So this sense of hopelessness comes in today. Our suicide rate is higher and our mortality rate is higher. Our life expectancy is going down, right? So all of these things come into place, but we're not addressing the true issue of economic or government problems that's taking place. What's happening is we're told that the immigrants are taking our jobs. We're told that Black folks are getting job quotas because of affirmative action, which is totally not true. But all of these things come into play. So people have this fear of this stuff taking place. And then we have people that are just opportunists that just want to make money off of this. So Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley are presidential. They're going to run for president in 2024, right? No doubt about it. And what do they see? They see this as an opportunity to gain supporters. So we're going to go ahead and ride this coattail of the election being wrong because Donald Trump is still very popular. He is the leader of the Republican Party still. And so people are going to ride that coattail, trying to see if they can get for political aspirations or even medical aspirations, or not financial aspirations. And then we have media personalities making millions. Possibly billions. So we have two new players in this game that are even further to the right than Fox News. People who watch Newsmax and One American Network are saying that Fox News is the liberal media. When the hell did that happen? Right? So all this stuff is taking place right now, and we're seeing that there's a possibly an influx of violence that's still going to happen. So understand that when the FBI and the United States government is saying that this is just the tip of the iceberg for this year and possibly in future years, understand that this is happening. But there's no accountability. There's nothing that's taking place, right? The United States of government and the United States media are to blame. And we never address systemic racism in our society. And we don't, failure of our education system, which we don't talk about these type of things. The government agencies do little and politicians often stop them, right? So the Trump administration knew that the number one terrorist threat in our society was white nationalism, but he didn't do anything about it and actually defunded some components from the groups that are investigating this. Corporate owned media is a terrible, terrible thing in our society. They don't do anything. They are not taken seriously. They are not taking the idea of white nationalism seriously, and they only care about ratings. And this is all corporate media. I'm not talking about Fox News. I'm talking about MSNBC, CNN, all the others that are corporate owned. Their goal is to make money, and that's it. And conservative media is now lying and have no accountability. There's no pushback other than a few folks on the internet. But Antifa and socialists are storming the castle, or the ones that stormed the castle. It wasn't Trump supporters. It wasn't white nationalists. It was somehow anti-fascists and socialists that were the ones that were causing all the violence. So once again, we see this characterization of the left as being the evil ones and the people on the right as being the righteous ones, but also seeing that there is a massive misinformation system that's taking place in our society. So what I'd like for possibly, if you ever need to, I can give you this information and I can give you these links that would address this. Or if you watch the video, if you're watching the video later on, you can have this information available for you as well. So that is the end of this. I apologize for taking a little bit longer, but I am open for questions. So please, if anybody has any questions or comments they'd like to have up, I'd love to be ready to have a discussion. But I thank you all for staying after the given time, and love to have a chat with you about this as soon as I figure out how to stop the share. All right.
Thank you so much, Frank. Kaden, do you have any questions to share? I have at least one over here.
Yeah, I've got two over here, but do you want to go first?
Sure. Okay, so Frank, someone asked, my question is, do you believe the reinstatement of the Fairness Doctrine will benefit American society, or do you believe there needs to be more changes in society and legislature beyond the reinstatement?
I think that the Fairness Doctrine is basically saying that there has to be, I'm trying to figure out the best way to explain it, but it's basically not to have, there's a certain agreement that news media has with the government that they have to allow a certain amount of time with news and actual factual news, right? And so in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan got rid of the Fairness Doctrine, which kind of perpetuated and expanded this monopolies of corporate-owned media. So we look at the media is owned by our entire media, like everything we consume on television is owned by like 6 or 7 corporations. Everything, music, radio stations, all that kind of stuff. And so what the Fairness Doctrine would do was break those down into not necessarily having a monopoly in our society when it comes to the media having control of every aspect of our consumption of information. So I think there needs to be a Fairness Doctrine. I think it needs to be revamped, but I also think that the Fairness Doctrine wouldn't do anything regarding misinformation on the internet. And that is because of older people only watch the Fox News or MSNBC, right? So you're talking about people in their 60s and 70s that watch those programs. Everybody else gets their information oftentimes online. And so we need some type of accountability with the internet. But as Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist, says, is that we can't separate the fact from the BS. And that's a big problem in our society. So how are we going to regulate the internet without infringing on freedom of speech? I don't know, but the Fairness Doctrine, when it comes to our media conglomerates, I think it's a very important component that we need to have, and a revamping, a revised version of it.
Thanks, Frank. Kaden, do you want to ask your questions?
Yeah, okay, so the first one I have, what recommendations do you have to try to engage with people that identify as conservative, disavow white supremacy, but continue to support the Republican Party in what it is becoming?
That's a tough one, because I know people that are conservative and that aren't, that I would not look at as racist, from that standpoint. They're not necessarily followers of Rush Limbaugh, but they have certain principles, right? So conservatism itself is not necessarily evil. It's just that there's conservative circles that have the largest voice, the loudest voice, that wind up dominating the discussion. So I think what needs to happen is there needs to be a pushback to have a more moderate approach of conservative ideology in our society, that needs to be done by people who are those moderate conservatives, the ones that you're talking about, Kate, or the person that's asking that question is talking about. For us to talk about it, I think that what's going to happen, or what could happen, is that the Republican Party could be either the party of Trump, or it could be the party of what they believe regarding those values of, fiscal responsibility, or, I don't want to use the term traditional values, but more of a, values that are more cultural, that are very related to our United States, of a so-called traditional type of idea. But it's kind of hard to talk to those folks. I mean, it depends on the person you're talking to. I've had conversations with them too, and saying, "Man, what's going on with your party?" And they'd be like, "Yeah, I don't know what the hell's going on with my party," but they still wind up staying loyal to that party, and I think that's something that they have to do with them themselves.
Awesome, thanks, Frank. Last question I had was, will you be able to post the PowerPoint to Canvas for the class?
Yeah, I can do that. Yes. So thank you for my class, my students. Appreciate y'all staying and participating in this.
Awesome. Thanks, Frank. Oh, we just had one more come in, sorry. How much do you think the lost cause myth that was promoted by groups like, hang on, we are scrolling down. Sorry. How much do you think the lost cause myth that was promoted by groups like the Daughters of the Confederacy advanced white supremacy during Reconstruction, helped reestablish home rule in the South after home rule in the South after the Compromise of 1876, and still does to this day?
Yeah. So the lost cause is basically this discussion of that the Confederacy was righteous in their succession, righteous in their fighting for for the Confederate States of America, saying that slavery was not a cause of the Civil War. So it's this idea that, and it spreads, right? So even today, we have this lost cause ideas when we see like Civil War statues or Confederate statues and monuments. It's the idea that those people are righteous or somehow just in what they were trying to do, and so it was. I know that some people even say that the South actually won the Civil War because they won the history of the Civil War, of making the South look like they were the victors in this war, without actually winning the war. That they were the heroes, they were the ones that were doing right. And so when it comes to this idea of the lost cause, I think it has a huge part of what's taking place right now, because people don't have a true understanding of history. So in class, I've talked to students before, and I say, "What's the purpose of the Civil War?" And some of them be like, "I don't know purpose of civil war is. And it's like overwhelmingly, it should be slavery, right? So slavery should be the number one thing. The Confederate States even said it themselves. And so when it comes to the Confederate flag, people look at the flag as a symbol of rebellion, not necessarily a symbol of white supremacy, a symbol of Southern pride, not necessarily white supremacy. Now, we can have a discussion about all those components of the Confederate flag, but that's not necessarily the case of why the Confederate flag becomes so popular. It becomes popular because Southern politicians and people in the South use that flag as a form of intimidation in those states, and they put it in the Capitol building, saying that, look, you're not going to get any justice here, right? So the image of the police with the Confederate flags, just sitting there with that becomes that idea of like, hey, whose side am I on? Whose side am I on? So yeah, the lost clause is a huge problem. There's a couple scholars that are really good at talking about the lost cause. One is Kevin Levine, and another one, I want to say Kevin M. Cruz, but I'm not really too sure if it was him or someone else. But there's people that write about the lost cause itself and talk about the problems of it.
Thanks, Frank. We just had one more question. I think we might wrap up for tonight. So one person asked, where's a good place to access the news that isn't so biased?
All right. So all news has bias. All news. We can't get rid of it. The key thing is that information informing us, right? So let's talk about climate change. So let's use climate change as an example. If we want to find true information about climate change, we don't want to have both sides, like one side being right, one side being wrong. We won't say like giving validation. Just say, well, you know what? Or how about use this? The earth is flat, right? So we have a news source that talks about the earth being round. But then we also say, well, on the other hand, the earth is flat. We don't want that. We want accurate, authentic, true stuff. And so I know that somebody just posted that PBS NewsHour is a good source, and it is. But the thing about PBS NewsHour, and my favorite news source is called Democracy Now!, those sources are boring compared to what we watch on CNN, Fox, MSNBC, right? So we like to see the flash. We like to see the flare. We like to see people arguing, but that's not necessarily news. But that's what our interpretation of actual news is. So if you grew up in an era like me and maybe some of the other faculty that are listening, the era of Walter Cronkite, he was just a guy and he gave you the news straight down. And he said, this is the news. This is how it is, right? And he may have had bias in certain things because he was against the Vietnam War or something along those lines. But the key is that you have to find news that is not going to tell you what to think. Corporate media tells you what to think. So you have to find a news source that is going to just give you good quality information. Now, it could have some bias because all news is going to have a certain way of swaying people, but is the information going to be valid? So I would say, like somebody said, PBS NewsHour, Democracy Now! Is probably my favorite news source and my best choice of the news source. I mean, even from somebody that's from the left, right? So you look at the Young Turks. Young Turks is terrible. I like them, but they're terrible when it comes to accurate news because they sway so much and they want you to think the way that they think. And I think it's very problematic with just using those places as just sources. So look at multiple ones, but make sure that they are not telling you what to think.
Thank you. Caden, did you have anything else? Or, oh, sorry, did someone unmute themselves? Okay. Caden, did you have any other questions on your end?
No more questions. I would just add to the reputable sources. It's really hard, like Frank said, to find something that isn't biased. So I think a skill that we all could tend to work on is just developing some of that media literacy for ourselves and be able to identify when that like inflammatory language is happening. Just like the examples that Frank, you had earlier. I think of like when people use the word culture instead of talking about race. I see that one all the time popping up in the news, or you know, being spoken out loud. So just kind of being able to identify those things and be, you know, just like those red flags of like, like, is this accurate?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's like the way the wording is. It was just kind of hard because that's how we look at racism. Because when we think about racism, we always think about like the Bull Connor, stopping people from integrating into like buses or something along those lines, or getting access to voting and getting their heads bashed in and stuff. And that's how we look at racism in the traditional sense. But racism is so nuanced, it's so complex that when we see racism, we don't even know that it's actually racism, right? So we think like housing discrimination. We say, well, how can you prove that that's racism, right? We can see the statistics and saying that, blacks are getting, are charged a higher interest rate, or blacks are not showing specific neighborhoods. Well, somebody say, well, maybe they just didn't think this, that, or the other. And so they try to like dismiss it as not racism because they didn't say the N-word or something along those lines. And I think that's a big problem because we don't necessarily have the knowledge or critical thinking to really point out what racism actually is. So that's a big problem for us in our society.
Well, thank you so much, Frank, and thank you for those who were able to stay and engage in dialogue here tonight. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up this session, but I hope that you continue to engage with future sessions within the MCIC series. Thank you all, and I hope that you have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.